In this video, we're going to talk about Salesforce Flow best practices. We're going to understand why it is so important to use best practices while we implement Salesforce flows, and we're going to see 5 different examples of best practices and understand how to use them while we implement flows. So if you want to boost your admin skills, you must understand how to implement efficient flows. You may create a non-efficient flow that might work, it might meet business requirement, it might pass QA, it might even live in production, but in the future it might exceed limitations. For example, if someone adds some more functionalities to the same flow, or if someone adds some more flows to the same objects. So we want to make sure we support maintenance and we support scalability while we don't exceed limitations. So let's see 5 different examples of best practices. The first best practice is use entry criteria. We want to make sure we define clear entry criteria, especially when we create a record trigger flow, because we want to make sure the flow runs only on relevant records. We want to enhance performance, improve efficiency, reduce errors, and maintain scalability. So let's see an example. In this example, we see a record trigger flow. We can see it triggers on a case object whenever a record is updated. We did not add any entry conditions here, so we don't have any entry criteria. What the flow does, it has a decision element that checks if the contact was updated, then it sends an email. Or if the contract manager was updated, then it sends an email. Because we don't have any entry criteria, whenever the case is updated, and it doesn't matter which field got updated, the flow will trigger. We want to make sure the flow does not trigger on records which are not relevant, because we want to use as less resources as possible to trigger flows. So let's see how we can do it differently. We added an entry criteria. We want to make sure the flow runs only when a contact is changed to a non-null value, or when a contract manager is changed to a non-null value. That will help us to prevent the flow from running whenever it does not need to run. The second best practice is minimize the use of DML actions. So what are DML actions? Get records, create records, update, and delete. We want to make sure we use those DML actions as less as we can. DML actions are interactions with a database. Every interaction we have with a database is expensive for us. We pay with resources whenever we interact with a database. That's the key of best practices of flow. That's the key of making our flow more efficient. We want to interact as less as we can with a database. We want to optimize performance and avoid limitations. So let's see an example here. We have here a record trigger flow that triggers on a case. And we can see we have a get record here, which gets the account whenever the case is updated. It checks what was updated on the case. If the priority was updated to emergency, then it updates the account. And it checks if the case was escalated. And if it was escalated, then again it updates the account. So we're using DML actions here 3 times. 1, 2, 3. We're using our expensive resources 3 times, and we want to try to minimize the use in order to pay less and to make our flow more efficient. So we can see here, instead of using a get record element, we just used the record, the case that triggered the flow, and we got the account from there. And then instead of updating the account twice, we used assignments, which are not expensive for us in the way we use flows. And we updated the account. We reached the database only once. We updated the account only once at the end. The third best practice is do not use DML actions in loops. So we spoke about DML actions and how expensive they are for our resources, and we want to make sure we minimize the use of them inside loops in order to optimize performance and avoid limitations. So let's see an example. We have a record trigger flow on accounts, and it triggers whenever the account is updated and the contract manager is updated to a non-null value. What the flow does, it gets related cases to the account, and then it loops on all the cases and it checks if the case is open, then it updates the case. So we're using an update element inside the loop. In this example, if we have 50 different cases that are related to the account and all of them are open, then we reach the database 50 times for every record that runs in the loop. That's a lot. Let's see how we can minimize reaching the database and using DML actions in the loop. So instead of using the update element in the loop, I used the assignment elements. So I assigned the contract managers to the case, and then I assigned the case to a case collection, and I updated the case, all the cases at once using the collection only at the end of the flow. So instead of triggering the update element many times inside the loop, I triggered it only once at the end of the flow. The fourth best practice is use a before save flow. So always use a before save flow whenever you can. Whenever you update the record that triggers the flow, use a before save flow. That's in order to prevent recursive updates and improve performance. In this example, we have a record trigger flow that updates the case whenever the case is created and the account is not null. We can see here that the actions and related records is marked. That means that we're using an after save flow. What the flow does, it updates the record that triggers the flow. It updates the case itself that triggered the flow. So what happens here is this flow is triggered after save. That means that the record is saved to the database, and then the flow triggers, and what it does, it actually updates the record again. So we reach the database twice. That's expensive for us. Also, it may re-trigger any automations that we have on an after save in the same case. So an automation may trigger once when we save the case at the beginning, and it may re-trigger after we save the updates here. So let's see how we do it correctly. First of all, we marked the before save update. That's the fast field update here that you can see. And we use an assignment because we can assign the relevant data that we want to the fields instead of using the update element. That will assign them before it saves to the database, and it will save the whole record together with the assignment. The fifth best practice is use fault path. We want to implement fault path in our flow for error handling, user experience, debugging, and data integrity. So we can see here a flow that we saw before that updates the account, and we use the fault path. So whenever the account is updated and we get an error for any reason, what we do here is we use a fault path, and in this case we sent the case owner an email to tell him there was a failure, and he can go into the record and fix the failure. We can also use a screen element to notify the user that triggered the flow, to notify him there was an error in the flow. So we spoke about 5 different best practices. Use entry criteria, minimize the use of DML actions, do not use DML actions in loop, use before save flow, and use fault path. And remember, try to reach the database as less times as possible.